In this podcast episode, David Kessler, a leading grief expert and best-selling author, explores the complex nature of grief and its impact on life. He shares his insights on the 6 stages of grief, the importance of witnessing pain, the interplay between grief and love, and how individuals can navigate loss, trauma, and unresolved feelings to find meaning, hope, and healing. Kessler draws from personal tragedy and years of professional experience, offering practical strategies and deep compassion for anyone dealing with grief, whether from death, divorce, job loss, or other significant changes. David begins by explaining the original 5 stages of grief identified by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, emphasizing that these stages are observed patterns rather than prescriptive rules. He highlights his addition of a 6th stage, meaning, which represents a deeper transformation beyond accepting the loss. Grief, in his definition, is any unwanted change, not just death. These stages apply broadly, including breakups, job losses, and other life disruptions. Managing change, and by extension grief, is crucial for happiness and well-being. Kessler stresses that grief must be witnessed by others for healing to occur. Experiencing another person recognizing the value of what was lost and validating the pain, love, and attachment is vital. This witnessing builds connection and counters the isolation grief can cause. Connection, rather than solitude, is what helps to ease pain, as grief is fundamentally a severance or separation. Proper witnessing includes acknowledging both the depth of suffering and the person's capacity to move forward. David shares his own profound grief after the unexpected death of his younger son David, revealing the intensity of being both a grief expert and a grieving parent simultaneously. Despite his knowledge, he struggled with denial, anger, and bargaining, revisiting these stages multiple times. This personal loss propelled him to reconsider the grief process, recognizing that acceptance alone did not provide enough healing or meaning. His experience underlines that grief is an ongoing journey rather than a linear process. A turning point in Kessler's healing came through revisiting Viktor Frankl's work and understanding that meaning does not lie within the tragic event, but within the person's growth and transformation afterward. Meaning is found in who we become and how we choose to live following loss. David acknowledges the impermanence of life, the illusion of control, and the power we have over how we live in each moment. This shift opens the possibility for joy, gratitude, and purposeful living to coexist with grief. Kessler articulates that grief and love are inseparable. To fully experience love, one must be willing to embrace grief. Playing it safe to avoid grief leads to less joy, while vulnerability expands life's richness. Grieving well allows for deeper connections and fuller living, while avoiding grief equates to avoiding life and love altogether. According to him, the risk of grief is the price of genuine love. Bargaining is described as the mind's initial response to loss, where individuals replay what-if scenarios, trying to avoid the painful reality. While natural early in grief, lingering in bargaining becomes a form of avoidance that inhibits healing and progress. Kessler highlights that unresolved grief and rumination can sap energy, contributing to self-sabotaging behaviors and strained relationships. Managing this stage involves acknowledging the pain while gradually confronting reality. A significant part of the conversation focuses on cultural challenges in expressing grief and feelings, particularly among men. David explains that many men have not been taught to navigate emotions and tend to avoid vulnerability, often needing alternative ways to connect, such as shoulder-to-shoulder conversations rather than face-to-face emotional check-ins. He emphasizes that suppressing feelings leads to judgment and isolation, and that vulnerability should be seen as a strength rather than a weakness. Kessler discusses the grief illiteracy in society, noting how people often lack the skills to support grieving individuals or even recognize grief. This lack leads to people being stuck in grief or isolated because their pain is misunderstood or minimized. He explains the importance of choosing the right audience for sharing grief and finding community with others who understand, such as in grief support groups. Safe spaces make witnessing and healing possible. The concept of unintended grief is introduced to describe grief people carry without conscious awareness, which often manifests as unresolved anger, automatic reactions, or self-sabotage. Kessler points out how unattended grief can underlie difficulties in relationships, work, and personal well-being. Recognizing grief behind anger and frustration can create pathways toward healing and help break cycles of dysfunctional behavior. Connection and support are central themes throughout the podcast. David encourages people to find at least one person to share their grief with, explaining that connection is a powerful antidote to isolation and despair. He describes the benefits of grief groups, online and in person, where shared stories foster empathy, understanding, and accountability. Support amplifies capacity to face pain and navigate grief's complexity. Triggers serve as a map to unresolved pain and healing opportunities. Kessler stresses that trying to control the external environment to avoid triggers leads to emotional avoidance and estrangement. Healing requires recognizing triggers and working through the associated feelings, even though it can be difficult. Avoidance perpetuates suffering, while facing triggers facilitates transformation and freedom from past pain. David denies the notion that death and grief yield despair alone. Instead, he advocates for embracing life fully because of its fragile nature. His work with people at end of life reveals that fear of missing out on meaningful experiences is common, and he encourages living current, as if each day might be the last. This perspective shifts focus from loss to presence and gratitude. Kessler clarifies the difference between clinical depression and grief-related sadness, emphasizing the importance of professional evaluation. While grief includes waves of sadness and acceptance over time, depression can require medical intervention. Understanding this distinction prevents misunderstandings and supports appropriate care. Fear and anxiety about the future often stem from unaddressed past pain. David explains that such fears are ways the mind tries to anticipate and protect against harm, but can trap people outside of the present moment where love and connection happen. Bringing attention to the now is a critical healing step that requires support and intentionality. In relationships where one partner is stuck in grief or emotional avoidance, Kessler advocates for clear boundaries and gentle invitations toward healing, recognizing that change cannot be forced. He encourages acceptance of differences while fostering connection and growth. Setting boundaries protects one's well-being without trying to control the other person. Kessler shares his own experience of surviving childhood sexual abuse and the cultural silence that surrounds male trauma. He discusses how breaking this silence publicly transformed his life and gave others permission to explore and express their vulnerabilities. Healing grows from creating safe spaces and challenging societal expectations of masculinity. An important observation is how external success, wealth, or accomplishments do not resolve internal grief or feelings of unworthiness. Many people struggle with the illusion that achievement will fill an emotional void, but unresolved grief continues underneath. Kessler stresses that inherent worthiness is not earned through doing, but exists simply by being. The single most valuable skill Kessler prescribes for everyone is learning to get and give support. This does not necessarily mean professional therapy, but finding connection with friends, community, or volunteering. Connection is fundamental to resilience and navigating grief and change. David describes the development of accessible grief groups offered online, making it easier for people across time zones and life circumstances to find tailored support. These groups offer varied formats, topics, and a community that understands specific grief experiences, reducing isolation and facilitating healing. He shares stories illustrating the common guilt people feel when starting to experience joy after loss, including the misconception that being happy again disrespects those who have died. Kessler reframes loyalty to lost loved ones as living fully rather than being stuck in pain. Choosing to live again is an active decision that honors the depth of love experienced. David addresses common misconceptions around crying and emotional expression, especially among men. He explains how judging one's own feelings creates barriers to healing and advocates for accepting whatever emotional response arises without shoulds. Emotional acceptance is key to moving through grief healthily. Toward the end, Kessler briefly touches on parenting, emphasizing that most parents try their best and should practice self-compassion rather than harsh judgments. Learning from mistakes is part of growth. paralleling individual journeys through grief and healing. In closing, David Kessler leaves 3 final lessons. Love is the most important thing. We should soak in the good rather than just the bad, and the ongoing challenge and gift is to authentically be ourselves. Greatness for him means showing up fully for oneself and others.